Hello, and welcome to PL Talks. My name is David Johnson, and I'm a partner with Poole Lawyers, a Calgary-based law firm. Thank you very much, everyone, for waiting for a few moments as we ironed out a few technical issues. For those of you who are new to PL Talks, this interview series is a passion project for our firm, where we talk with artists about their work. We started these interviews with a focus on Alberta-based artists. Since the pandemic started, we have broadened our scope on occasion to talk with other Canadian artists. Today, I'm fortunate to be talking with Mark Blagrave. Mark was born on Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario. He spent his younger years in Ontario and Bermuda. By high school, Mark had moved to my home province of New Brunswick. After obtaining his BA at Mount Allison University and his MA and PhD at the University of Toronto, he taught at the University of New Brunswick and Mount Allison University until 2009, when he became Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Science at Huron University College in London, Ontario. He returned to New Brunswick in 2016 and settled in St. Andrews, where he has worked and lived ever since. During his time as a professor, Mark has taught English literature, theater, film, and creative writing. Mark became involved in theater early in life. He has written plays which have been performed in venues throughout New Brunswick. Mark has had 3 books published. His first, Silver Salts, was shortlisted for 2 awards in 2009, the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best New Novel, and the Margaret and John Savage First Book Award. His next book, Salt in the Wound, was a collection of short stories published in 2014. Lay Figures, his latest offering, centers on an aspiring writer and a group of artists around the time of the onset of World War II. In the most extreme example of social distancing in PL Talks history, Mark is joining us today from his home in St. Andrews, New Brunswick. Mark, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me, and I'm delighted to be joining a long line of Maritimers who wend their way west, even if I've only done it virtually today.
Well, it is wonderful to have you, and in preparing for this talk, I've greatly enjoyed reading your works and reading about the different St. John landmarks and streets. Brought a lot of nostalgia and good memories for me, and it's a great honor to be talking with you here today.
Thank you.
Your latest book, rather, Lay Figures, is set in St. John, New Brunswick, in the late 30s and early 40s, and it follows an aspiring writer, Elizabeth McKinnon, on her first time from home, and she falls into a community of artists and is influenced by them and interacts with them and becomes one of their own. This book had, for me, a lot of wonderful elements to it. There are some great themes of love and betrayal, discussing what it meant to make art and to be an artist in difficult times. As the author of this work, what did Lay Figures mean to you?
Well, it started, I guess, as a kind of a homesickness cure. I was living in London, Ontario at the time, and I was feeling kind of sad about not being in the Maritimes, to be honest. So I thought, well, maybe I can write my way back into St. John. So that was kind of the beginning of the idea. And it also what I wanted to try to do was to do something a little bit different in New Brunswick literature. There's a lot of really wonderful New Brunswick literature that is very rural in its setting. So there's there's lots of snowmobiles and trucks with big tires and moose and so on. And it's all wonderfully done. But there is another side of New Brunswick. We do have cities here, contrary to some people's belief. St. John is a truly magnificent city that has 250 years of what we would think of as high Western culture, I guess. And so I wanted to try to do something with that to give people an insight into what a truly civilized place St. John is. And as you say, I mean, as with any artist, I'm always obsessing about how does it get made, and how do I relate to my subject. So this seemed a good chance to do that.
The setting of the late 30s and early 40s. Is there anything special about this time period in St. John history that led you to set the book then?
Yeah, absolutely. Because of the Depression, a lot of St. Johners came home. So a lot of artists who were studying in New York and Chicago and Paris and London and so forth were all obliged to return where they had family supports. And the result was that probably more than any other period in St. John's history, these really highly trained, very skilled artists came together and were able to interact. It's not a big city, so they would have fallen over each other whether they wanted to or not. Sometimes they didn't want to, but it was a real kind of pressure cooker, late 30s, early 40s. And so that appealed to me as a kind of high point in St. John's visual art history, for sure.
One of the many interesting things about your book, and you mentioned this in the author's note, is that there were some real-world inspirations for some of your characters, including two in particular, rival painters, named Frank and William in the book. What can you tell us about the painters who may have been templates for those two characters?
Thank you for saying may have been. They, I wanted some painters who would be as opposite from one another as possible, while still being believable within the context. So the two that presented themselves to me, and they didn't quite beg to get into the book, but I was delighted to invite them, were Jack Humphrey and Miller Britton, and they represented for me, and this is a very boiled down version, but represented for me in Humphrey's case, a very formal, studied, technically accomplished approach to painting. And in Britton's case, the inspiration came from his heart, or sometimes somewhere even lower than that.
Well, in preparation for today, you were kind enough to share some of the paintings for each of these real life artists, and I know that a number of our viewers have an arts background, so I thought it might be interesting for them to look at some of these paintings, and I was wondering if you could maybe kind of walk us through what you found about their styles in your research for the book. So the first artist, Jack Humphreys, our first selection is simply titled Portrait. What can you tell me about the art of Jack Humphreys at this time?
Yeah, well, I think the portrait certainly shows the technical accomplishment of the man. And it's a very classically kind of constructed portrait, very kind of subtle coloring and so forth. But it's not. It may be a little mysterious. It's not moving in a really visceral kind of sense, so that you're wondering, I think, at the brilliance of the work, and the work is visible in the brushstrokes and so forth. So it has I guess what wiser people than I might call a painterly kind of quality to it, that was appealing to me for the character of Frank as the more reserved and technically accomplished of the two warring painters in the book.
And in the book, Frank, who was not Jack Humphreys, does a number of these portraits. But in the book, he also moves along to doing landscapes. And our second picture is a landscape titled Landscape with Trees and Water. I think that it's kind of interesting that the character Frank kind of goes along, and I think it's this landscape and the portrait painting one differs from the works of Miller Britton. So if we can go to the third picture, this is a work by Miller Britton, who is maybe a little analogous to the character William, and its title is Cartoon for St. John Tuberculosis Hospital Murals. And all of these pictures are found on the New Brunswick Museum website, except for our last one, which we'll get to in a minute. But what can you tell me about how Miller Britton differs from Jack Humphreys?
In the cartoon there, you see very much the strain of social realism, late 30s social realism. And now I'm not looking at it, so I can't remember on which side. But basically, the power of medicine to lift people out of their deep poverty. So on one side of the cartoon, you have people living in abject poverty and quite clearly starving and so forth. And on the other side, you have the healing power of medicine, both medically and socially. So this kind of public art was very common in the 30s for sure, and getting a commission like Miller Britton did, it didn't work out in the end, but getting that commission would have been not only a huge feather in his cap, but also would have put some soup in his bowl, which in the 30s was pretty important too. But it's a much more raw, I guess gutsy would even be the word, than either of those Jack Humphrey paintings, and so that contrast of two very different approaches to subject was part of what appealed to me in casting those characters.
In lay figures, William has a similar commission, and there's some description of the creation of these cartoons. And one of the things that really struck me about your book and that I loved to read was how in depth you went with these different artists and their process. And that you as a writer were able to get into the shoes of this painter doing these cartoons for the purpose of designing a mural, and you got into other artists' shoes as well. Miller Britton did a number of other paintings as well, and our next and final one, entitled Longshoremen, I think matches up well with our first reading. If you're ready, Mark, then we can leave this picture up as you go through your first reading.
Sure. Just to set it up very, very briefly, Libby, who is well, at this point, she's a poet. She's going to become a novelist, is wandering the streets of St. John looking for inspiration. She tends to map out her walks and try to make them mean something, either form letters or form pictures and so forth. It never really works out. But one day she finds herself on Long Wharf. William didn't see me at first, and I broke my rule by standing still to observe him. I told myself this was all right, because he was himself so obviously observing. It was obvious to me anyway, though most people probably wouldn't have noticed. He had gone out of his way to avoid notice. The brim of his hat was snapped down low over his eyes, and he had positioned himself in a loading doorway, taking advantage of the shadow cast by an enormous concrete pier. I followed the angle of his hat to determine what he was looking at. They were what my mother would call rough men. Unshaven, unwashed, she would say, their huge upper bodies out of proportion with the rest. Longshoremen, most of them, but there was a knot of casual lookers-on as well, men too old or too weak or too unlucky to be hired on. Unemployed, they came to watch the others work, their open spectatorship the exact opposite of William's furtive stance. As I watched him, I could see that he had a small red notebook in his left hand and a stub of a pencil in his right. Each time one of the longshoremen looked as if he might be looking his way, William palmed the pencil and made a show of examining his fingernails. I was not convinced that this gesture would be any more welcomed by the men than the sketching, but I supposed he knew what he was doing, had done this before. "What are you looking at, sister?" It was one of the lookers-on. He had a cigarette and blew a cloud of smoke towards me. It was time to move along. I cursed myself for breaking my rule. "Looking for a fella, is that it? You're about 10 years too late. One time this used to be the spot. Problem is we ain't got no dough, and you ain't going to give it away for free. Not in that coat and this economy." His mates laughed as if he were Noel Coward. I could hear the ripples of their mirth, punctuated by the sound of my hurried heels clopping as I ran half the way up Smythe Street. And then the ice got me. My feet went out. I seemed to pause for a second in the air before gravity reasserted itself. My coat cushioned my tailbone and elbow, but nothing could prevent the wind being knocked out of me. I sat for a moment trying to catch my breath, and then William was there. "You look like you could use some help." "I'm fine, thank you, just winded." "Well, all right, I could use a hand. It's very slippery. Are you following me?" "I was going to ask you the same thing." "I go for walks. It helps me think." I began to brush myself off. "Around here?" "I doubt it." "The walking or the thinking?" "Both." "You blew my cover. I'd have thought I provided a distraction. I couldn't stay, not once they could see I was there, thanks to you. Why not just ask if you could sketch them? Why the cloak and dagger?" "Respect, I think. Compassion." "You're not that bad a painter, surely?" It was the kind of flirty, teasing thing I thought Suzanne might say to him. "Compassion for their lot in life," he continued, ignoring my joke. "For the hand they've been dealt. It can't be right for me to turn all of that into a painting that I can sell for money. Why should their poverty help put food on my table?" "You could pay them. Give them something in return for what you're taking from them." "I can't afford to pay, and it's not that simple. I am who I am. They are who they are. What gives me the right to treat them as subjects for my work?" "You think it's condescending? But if you capture their condition, if you say something important about the way things are for them, maybe something will change." "You are new to all of this, aren't you?" "It's good to have hope," I said then, suspecting that I was simply confirming his assessment of me. "I can paint them, but I'm not one of them. What does that make me?" "An artist. It makes you an artist." It seemed so obvious to me, but he grimaced. What does Lear say? You know the line. Take physic, pomp. Expose thyself to feel what wretches feel. How can I accomplish that? I produce my paintings of these men in the studio, you know. I make the working sketches down by the docks where they work. But then I go back to my comfortable studio to recreate what I saw. With models? Unpaid models, I suppose, since you're so broke. I use lay figures. What's that? You know, those little wooden model people with lots of joints. You can make them do anything almost, bend them how you want. I only have the one, actually. I have to move them around in different poses. Can I see your sketches? He tore 3 sheets roughly from the red notebook in his hand and passed them to me. By then we were ambling along Water Street. The wind off the harbour made my eyes blurry with tears, but I stopped walking so I could give the sketches my full attention. What he had recorded was nothing like what I had expected. I had supposed I would see a tiny version of the scene that had been spread out before us. Instead, the sheets were covered in abstract directional lines and scribbled notes. Here and there were some thumbnail sketches of a recognizable detail, the line of a chin, the crook of an elbow, the way a trouser leg fell over a boot. But there was nothing that suggested what I would call an actual picture. Evidently, what he did was more complicated than I had thought.
Very powerful scene. So at this point in the story, the main character, Lily, is still trying to find her voice as a writer. She's incorporating herself into this community, and as a reader, I got the sense that she almost felt like she was a bit of a fraud still at this point, and not quite a writer yet. The way that you describe Lily and the way that you develop her as a character is a lot more well-rounded than you sometimes read from a male author. When you're writing female characters such as Lily or the main character in Silver Salts, how do you approach those characters who are developing before the reader's eyes in a way that makes them more well-rounded and more like actual people?
Well, you're kind to say that that's the end product. How do I get there? I mean, the thing with both of those books is that the character I was most interested in happened to be female, and it seemed to me that really they needed to tell their own stories. But there is a certain amount of I'm not quite sure what it is, craziness maybe in my trying to inhabit those characters. But I guess a couple of things. One is that writing is about exercising empathy, as one hopes on the other end reading is too, and so walking in somebody else's shoes of whatever kind of shoe they might be is part of the gig, I think. It also, I guess, enables me as a writer a little bit of distance from the character, and something for me very important is that the reader not confuse the author with the narrator. I've bored students with this for 30 years, but that these people are not, characters in books are not people. And they are a series of dots that are inscribed, and the reader joins them. So sometimes you get lucky and you lay the dots down in a way that the reader is pleased with and thinks, yeah, this is credible. Other times you maybe strain the credibility a bit, but I guess, yeah, for me it was an exercise in empathy, an exercise in imagination, and it is also just very much a kind of strategic maneuver on a reader to kind of show the man behind the curtain.
Well, you certainly hit the empathy just right, in my opinion, as I was reading the books. They certainly come across as more well-rounded characters than you sometimes see in a novel, and more sympathetic as a result. Do you find characters that are, say, less based in reality, easier to write than characters like, say, William and Frank, who have some basis in historical fact?
Yeah, I don't know that I would draw a line that's as neat as that. I think, I mean, with William and Frank, I picked and chose and made a decision not to name them Jack Humphrey and Miller Britton very very definitely. So they are as well works of the imagination. But even Libby and in lay figures and Lily in Silver Salts, are they're bound to be based on people I've seen, people I've known, experiences people have told me they've had, and so forth. So nothing really gets made out of whole cloth, I guess. It's it's borrow a bit here and borrow a bit there.
One of the things that's stuck with me in lay figures, William is a very outspoken, very hard on the sleeve, genuine character for good or ill. And there's one point where he's talking about Canadian art, and this idea of Canadian art. And I think most people in the office will honestly agree that when it comes to painting and most art, I'm not the most well-versed person. I'm very bookish and I love books, but when it comes to art, I know what I like, and I'm not the art buff that some others in the office are. William has a few comments to make about Canadian art and whether there is such a thing as Canadian art. And he's especially critical of the Group of Seven. And I'm wondering where that came from, and if you can kind of delve into that a little bit for me.
Absolutely. Anybody living in Canada outside of Toronto and environs knows something about regionalism and some of the conflicts that have played out over the entire history of Canadian art. But the Maritimers in the late 30s, early 40s had a pretty solid beef against what they saw as a kind of homogenizing effect that was going on in Canadian art, and that really the Group of Seven managed to get I don't know whether we would call it now discoverability or what have you, but that they became very much what people associated with if you say Canadian art, then there had to be got to be a pine tree, there got to be a cliff, there got to be a this and a that, the Maritimers had started a Maritime Art Association in the 30s, which eventually got kind of hijacked basically up to Ottawa, and the magazine, the very good magazine that they were producing, became a Canadian art magazine from being a maritime art magazine, and they were I don't know whether I'm allowed to say pissed off, but they were pissed off. I'll ask forgiveness rather than permission there, And so yeah, absolutely the kind of bitterness that an artist like William in the book and Miller Britton in real life felt about the idea that if you don't make it in Toronto, you might as well forget it, was very, very real, and it hasn't, that hasn't entirely stopped in Canada, I think, and so I was hopeful in writing that particular scene where they kind of ream out the group of seven, that the contemporary artists working at the margins, working on the edges of this country might say, well, yeah, no, I get that. So whether that works or not, I'm not sure, but.
Yeah. It certainly, having grown up in New Brunswick, it certainly struck a bit of a chord, having heard comments like that in more general terms, and kind of the regionalism that you reference in more general terms. It struck a bit of a chord, and brought up a memory or two of conversations gone by. In Lily's interactions with the members of the artistic community at large at the time, and as she's building these friendships with members of the groups, it's almost as though she gets a chance to explore their mediums as a form of relationship building. She helps one character restring marionettes, and the description of how to restring a marionette was, more. It made it sound fun, and it was more involved than somebody, just glazing over the fact that they were restringing marionettes. She goes and digs clay and does pottery with other characters, and there are descriptions of things like psychic writing. And throughout Lay Figures, you touch on all these different mediums, and you do it in a way that makes it sound interesting and kind of fun to try. So did you have a chance to try any of these different mediums in preparation for the book? Did you have a chance to try your hand at psychic writing or pottery or any of these?
Not really. One of the greater gifts of the last 20 years has been the ability to use a keyboard to access endless information about almost anything anybody never cared about before, including how to string a damn marionette. So I mean, I did try to immerse myself a little bit into the process, recognizing, and it's a fine line that you walk always as a writer, that I mean, at what point do I put the reader to sleep with too much detail? At what point is it too much information about which string goes where and so forth? So while that wise advice about, drinking deep or or taste not the Hyperion spring or whatever, little knowledge is a dangerous thing. A little knowledge for a novelist is just about the right amount of knowledge, because you then manage not to, you hope anyway, not to put the reader to sleep, but persuade them that the lies you're telling are at least based in some kind of truth.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk a little more in detail about Silver Salts, your first novel. So this one is also set in St. John, and in contrast with Lay Figures, which takes place over a relatively shorter period of time, the main character in Silver Salts goes through a number of rather large local events, from labor uprisings to the First World War, the influenza pandemic of 1919, and the kind of burgeoning film industry in the early 20s in the city. What drove you to write about this period of time and to write specifically this story?
I guess it had its roots really in research I was supposed to be doing about some other things in theater history in St. John. So for my academic career, if you will, and I came across an article about a silent film that had been made in St. John, New Brunswick, and doesn't exist anymore. Nobody knew much about it, but it struck me that this film that had essentially been erased, what if that had been the life-defining moment for a character? What if there was a young woman, let's say, in St. John, New Brunswick, who, let's say, became a stand-in for the later, much very famous silent film actor, Norma Shearer, and then the film just poof vanished. What would be the effect on that character? And it was a way, I guess, of exploring a number of things about becoming erased. It was a way of exploring things about image and the reproduction of image. One of the amazing things about the early part of the 20th century that we don't always remember anymore, because we have so many amazing things going on all the time now, was this the ability to mechanically reproduce an art object, a piece of music, an image in film, and so I guess that explains partly why choosing that era and that sweep from early in the First War to the advent of the talkies, which wasn't a lot of years, and obviously a lot went on socially, politically, and so on and so forth. But also artistically, it was a sea change.
And you have a reading from that book as well. Would you like to set the stage for that?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to read from the very, very beginning of the book. So Lily Dempster, who is the protagonist in the book, does, as I intimated earlier, does eventually stand in for Hollywood star Norma Shearer in this vanished movie, and then has to wrestle with control of her image, or was it Norma's image, and so on and so forth. But even as a little girl, Lily is struggling with image and how she looks. It may help to know that Norma Shearer had a cast eye, and I mean, part of, in fact, of her filmability was probably that slight unusual feature. So this is In the Looking Glass. It begins with a shattered mirror I hid beneath the floorboard. My face multiplied and imprisoned on every fragment. My earliest memory? It is the earliest story I remember telling myself. That amounts to the same thing. I do not feel the cuts on my hands until all the pieces have been cleaned up, but this doesn't surprise me. Fear has a way of focusing my mind. What's a little sting beside what my father will do if he finds the broken glass? I would like to stop to admire the new patterns on my palms, red streets on a map made just for me. But I must erase all traces right away. The blood would only lead them back to the glass, and the glass to the mirror. It is the way their minds work, in lines. So I find one of my mother's cloths, the ones only she uses. I'm pretty sure she doesn't have them counted out. I know he doesn't. The maps transfer perfectly onto the cotton. It's just like making a print. So I'm sorry to spoil the patterns as I squeeze the cloth in my hands to put pressure on the cuts. If anybody notices, I will say I fell on the street and landed on my palms. For that, I'll need some dirt. Dirt is no problem. It doesn't take long for the bleeding to slow. I push the cloth into the space between the joists where I've already gathered the shards of glass. The floorboard shrieks a little as I press it back in place. Quiet, I whisper back. My mother will miss the mirror. As early as tonight, when she goes to brush out her hair, she'll reach for the little hand glass to check the spot in the back she always worries about. The mirror is valuable, and there will be hell to pay. But not for me. Patrick and Mike will be suspected immediately. My brothers are known thieves, though only little things until now. Never what my mother calls an heirloom. Never anything so bold as a silver-backed, beveled glass hand mirror. It's only a matter of time before petty thieving turns to grand larceny, my father will say as he takes out the strap. Unless my mother suspects my father. In that case, she'll say nothing about the missing mirror. I've watched her back down from scenes with him a dozen times. That might be best in this case, even though it hurts to imagine her having to swallow all at once the pain of losing her mirror and the heartache of thinking that her husband has pawned it, or tobacco or another woman. Had I broken almost any other thing in the whole apartment, I would tell her, even though it might mean a licking. But with the mirror, it's different. It's not because it's an heirloom. It was my mother's, which takes it all the way back to Ireland. That's just what makes it sad. And it's not because mirrors are frowned upon for little girls, especially little girls on their own. At school, the nuns made sure there were no mirrors. Even puddles in the schoolyard seemed to dry up unnaturally quickly. The Vayner girls were forced to find their faces in the windows when the sun hit just right, or in the brass fittings on the great mahogany doors. I never tried that. Vanity was not my sin. You mustn't think that. I haven't been looking in my mother's prize mirror to admire what I see there. It is only to check on what a little boy said to me as I walked home this afternoon. He called me Wednesday. Why do you call me that? My name's Lily. Oh, he said, I thought it must be Wednesday. Why? Well, because your eyes are looking both ways for Sunday. And then he skipped off down Waterloo Street, chasing the rusty barrel hoop he had set to rolling. A lazy eye, my mother and father call it. Lily's got a bit of a lazy eye, they say, not minding much whether I'm near enough to hear them or not. My brothers never mention it, not even when they're dredging the gutters for insults, so it must be really bad. Whenever I moan about it, my mother hushes me up with a torrent of words. That's how God made you, my dear. It's not for us to question God's plans for us. Then she tells me how nice my hair is, or my nose. Had she been home when I came in, I might have told her about the mean boy, been given the sermon on God's will, and everything would have been as always. But only my brothers were there, playing that game of theirs with the ball on the stoop, and I went straight up to the apartment and into my mother's room. I took the mirror out to the sitting room window. The boy was right. I knew it was wrong to question God, but I did. Then I cried. Then I dropped the mirror, and it shattered. From every shard there wept back an image of me, Lily, my face captured over and over again, lazy eye and all, an awful fairy tale nightmare. This is what I do not want to explain to anyone, not even my mother. The floorboard in place, I hurry back into the street. I nod to Patrick and Mike as I race around the corner and into the alley, where I will be able to stash the embossed silver back of the mirror into the rusting bin, and then I will kneel to dirty my blood-sticky hands. So that's a little taste of poor little Lily.
And from there, Lily has a lot of highs and lows throughout the book. It's very powerful, very moving book. As a first novel, I'm curious to know what you learned from writing Silver Salts that helped you in assembling your short story collection, Salt in the Wound, and in writing your second novel, Lay Figures.
Well, it quite often happens, in fact, that people's second book is a collection of short stories, and I think that it has something to do with, oh my God, I can't do another one of those for a little while. So probably just the sheer scope of Silver Salts drove me with my tail between my legs to the short story for a while as a change, and I guess, I mean, writing about St. John is something that I enjoy doing with Silver Salts, and trying to capture some of the tensions of that place and the energy of that place. I wasn't entirely satisfied that I was finished with that, so that then kind of led into Lay Figures. And Lay Figures is a much happier book, certainly for the protagonist. There's a lot of people who have some pretty crummy lives in Lay Figures, but it's less highs and lows. And part of the point with Silver Salts was that it was meant to be a little bit like the kind of melodrama of a silent movie, where you did get those kinds of amazing highs and lows and spins in fortune and so forth. Lay Figures is closer, I guess, a little bit closer to the social realism of the 30s.
Yeah, there's a much different tone. There's a hope in Lay Figures that isn't always realized upon, but it's certainly more present than in Silver Salts.
And I'm getting older. That's that's maybe I'm not the same guy.
Well, we're going to be asking the audience for some questions here in a few moments. If anyone has any questions for Mark, whether you're watching on YouTube or if you're watching on Facebook Live, if you can enter your questions. We have one of my team members, Robin Young, collecting questions, and she's going to be providing them to me to give to Mark. So please don't be shy. I have some questions of my own to kind of get us started down the path here. One of the things that I was curious about and hoping that you can kind of give us your thoughts on, in Lay Figures, Libby, the main character, finds her voice by basically writing until she gets it. She if I can describe it that way, she tries psychic writing. She tries a couple of different methods. She toys with typewriters, and eventually she finds pen and paper, and she writes as the thoughts come. And tries to piece things together afterwards. And I was wondering how that compared with your own style, and whether that's a style that works for you as a writer.
Oh, I only wish it did. No, Dave, I am an inveterate outliner. I mean, and not only so that I can procrastinate on the actual writing, although that doesn't hurt, but before I sit down to write chapter one, I have a pretty clear idea and many pages of hierarchical notes, all subordinated to one another, about what's going to happen and where and so forth. So yeah, I mean, I admire writers like Libby who can simply let it come. But I guess I've not been that kind of writer. I try. I've been trying in some of the more recent stuff I've been doing, but oftentimes I'll get partway through something and then I'll think, oh no, God, I've got to write an outline. I can't. I don't know where this is going. It's I need that control, I guess. And so no, she's a very different kind of writer from the writer I am, and more power to her.
You've talked a bit about your reasons for writing about St. John, and I've made mention that. One of the draws to your writing for me is the nostalgia factor, and the fact that you can set a scene right beside Sim's Corner and have one of the characters almost involved in a car accident, and I can think back to my high school days and watching people almost get hit on that corner. It's a very infamous corner in St. John that really somebody should do something about. And maybe they have since I've moved. I don't know. But scenes like that, scenes like Lily in Silver Salts collecting loose tea leaves behind the Red Rose tea factory, and the places and the street names. In your experience, not only as a writer yourself, but also somebody who teaches, or taught for as long as you did in university, how tied do you think an author needs to be to the location they're writing about in order to truly capture the place?
Yeah, because Silver Salts was written when I wasn't living right in St. John, and I felt that distance was really important. Actually, that I could sit in Sackville, New Brunswick, which isn't terribly far away, but is a very different place. And imagine St. John, and then I would make a run down and wander the streets and imbibe St. John as much as I could, and then go back. So I mean, a little bit of distance doesn't hurt. But yeah, I mean, I think a writer needs to know the place. I think characters need to have, they need to exist in space, because they can't, of course, literally on the page, but so you have to provide that, and there's a lot of backfilling that goes on to do that. But and St. John has the huge advantage as a setting for fiction of having all kinds of tensions built into the fabric of the place. It also has the enormous ability of having been really broke for a very long time, which means that the buildings that you wander around and see in St. John are buildings that have been there for 150 years since the Great Fire of 1877. So whatever the math is on that, anyway, a good long time, and there is there's a real sense of history. There's a real sense that people have been here before me, which I think is also really important for a writer as he or she tries to enter into other persons' perspectives. That being in a place that is teeming with perspectives is pretty important. I love to read aloud. One of the many things I miss about teaching is that I used to subject my students to me reading some of the time to try to, I don't know, break it up or something. So that's a very sweet suggestion. So I'll entertain offers. I think that one of the most important things for anybody starting out writing novels is to read a lot of novels. And I think you can't do better than reading the old war horses of the 19th century. Jane Austen for voice and character and irony, Dickens for plot, so a lot of reading, and I think the way that you read is really important too. That as you read anything, and it doesn't have to be one of the old war horses of the 19th century, whatever it is you're reading, to continue to ask yourself, and it's very different from being a reader for pleasure. Ask yourself, okay, why that decision? Why that color? Why that order of diction? Because every, in a put together novel, every thing is a decision and a killing off of alternatives, to put it kind of awfully, and it's useful to, I think, to read other writers, not because you want to imitate them, but because you want to see the kinds of decisions that they've made. So reading a lot and reading carefully with a kind of slightly jaded, slightly cynical eye. Okay, what is this decision trying to do to me as a reader, and what can I as a writer learn from that decision? Probably the hardest part is knowing when to stop. And notwithstanding what I just said about you need to keep editing. At some point you do need to stop and say, okay, now I have to send this out and try to sell it. The most fun is really seeing something exist that didn't exist before. That maybe sounds a little bit simple-minded, but sometimes simple-minded is quite pleasing. And in this case, the idea that you've created a fabric of people and events that out of basically nothing. It's one of the most economically effective forms, because all it is words. It helps if they're in the right order.